I want to talk to you today about the deep history of food, what our ancient ancestors were really eating, and what this says about our diet today. Now, there was a book about 20 years ago that purported to address these very issues. The book was The Paleo Diet. Um, now, since then, cookbooks regularly come out on the paleo diet, and even today you can find grocery store items that purport to be paleo diet friendly. And I wanted to describe what the paleo diet is. I just read the book myself recently, and then I'm going to kind of do a lot of deconstruction of this book because there's a lot of nuance that this book and new evidence that this book doesn't account for. So, first of all, in a nutshell, what is this book about? The paleo diet is essentially saying that we are pre-programmed and genetically programmed and evolved to eat mainly lean meats with supplemented with a minor amount of non-starchy fruits and vegetables. And that the argument of the book is that since 10,000 years ago when agriculture started, so the Paleolithic is about a 2.5 million year period, and then about 10,000 years ago agriculture started, and since then we have added unnatural things to our diet. According to the book, we've added grains, legumes, milk-based products, and starchy foods, which are not healthy for us. According to the book, you will develop metabolic diseases if you eat starchy foods, grains, legumes, and milk-based products. So some of the evidence for this book, there's some fossil evidence. I mean, I think a lot of the evidence of the book is actually from a nutritional standpoint, not from a actually a genuinely evolutionary standpoint or archaeological standpoint. But some of the evidence that supports this book is a fossil record that, based on a limited number of fossils that are available at that time, seem to indicate that our ancient ancestors were essentially just eating meat all day long. We're top predators and we're just eating meat. And this is based on nitrogen isotope analysis of collagen in fossil bones. And then also there was some other evidence brought in. I wanted to single out one piece of evidence that was brought up in the book that I think is kind of interesting. In the book, it's mentioned that the Kung people of Africa, this is a group of people who eat a strict hunter-gatherer diet. They don't eat agricultural foods, and presumably, since Paleolithic people were hunter-gatherers as well, presumably they must be eating a fairly similar diet, arguably. Now, it's interesting they would bring this up because they don't really go into detail of the Kung people. I looked up some of the detail about the diet of the Kung people, and it's kind of interesting. So, based on some studies, the Kung people are actually eating more than 60% plant-based foods. They're not mainly eating lean meats supplemented with fruits and vegetables. They're mainly eating plant-based foods, in fact. Second of all, it's interesting that although it's a minor part of their diet, a regular, normal part of their diet is the consumption of wild legumes, which doesn't exactly match the book. So it's kind of interesting if you dig into some of the evidence brought up in the book, it doesn't quite match up. But let's just talk about the fossil evidence. So I dug into several scientific papers on this. I mainly read papers on Neanderthals or Neanderthals, however you want to pronounce it, in ancient, and to a lesser degree on ancient humans. Partly just caught my interest, but I would argue that Neanderthals are a very close cousin to us. We interbred with them. They're our direct ancestor, at least whatever 2, 3, 4% of our genome for a significant portion of us today. So it's very relevant what Neanderthals were eating. Now they went extinct 40,000 years ago approximately, but I think it's very relevant what they were eating. Moreover, based on scientific papers that I found and papers that I read, actually based on the environment they were in, they actually ate a remarkably similar diet to ancient humans. Meaning, if ancient humans were living in a tundra area where the only available food sources were large animals, and they would eat large animals, and so would Neanderthals. Whereas if Neanderthals were living in a coastal region with a different food source, they would eat that food source, and so would ancient humans. So in other words, there was a lot of parallels there about how they would eat. But let's just go into the fossil evidence. So obviously, when isotopic analysis was first developed, they were finding that ancient humans were essentially eating a lot of meat. New fossils have been found, especially in more coastal regions, but not necessarily in every case, but places like there's caves in what is today Spain, there's caves in what is today Greece and Israel, and there's a cave in what is today Iraq. And in all these places, what they find is that actually there's a lot of evidence of other types of food consumption. And this is based on the wear patterns of the teeth, which can indicate a lot of plant consumption. This is based on starch granules found on the teeth and tools. This is based on fossilized plants and animals that were found near and within campsites. This is based on dental calculus found on the teeth, and isotopic analysis as well of carbon and nitrogen. And what they're finding is that actually a lot of these people are eating a really varied diet. They were eating wild legumes, including something related to modern day chickpeas, or you might think of it as hummus. They were eating things like wild grains that are closely related to modern day wheat. They were eating a lot of starchy roots, as evidenced by the starch granules on their teeth and dental calculus and so on, and the artifacts, fossilized remains in their campsites. Starchy roots, wild grains, legumes. They were eating a lot of things, pine nuts, mushrooms. So clearly there was a lot of different things being eaten. And also I would point out that this idea that we're programmed to not eat starchy foods doesn't make sense. We have multiple copies of the amylase gene. This is a gene that codes for an enzyme that breaks down starches, and we have multiple copies of this gene. It doesn't make sense that we evolved to not eat starchy foods, and if we eat starchy foods, we're going to get metabolic disease if we have multiple copies of the amylase gene. And then maybe to bring in a little more genetic evidence, even when it comes to milk-based products, although our ancient ancestors did not eat milk-based products, did not drink milk except in infancy, and that's true. I mean, it was agriculture that developed that sort of food source. It appears that since the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago, we're adapting to that. We're developing the genetics for that. That in fact we are not pre-programmed to not have milk. So that doesn't add up either in some respects. And actually, there's evidence that people, based on the local environment and local ecosystem, could eat a radically different diet. It's not just meat, meat, meat. There's actually one Neanderthal individual they found in what is today Spain, that they looked at the dental calculus. Now, dental calculus is not a perfect fossil. There may be some issues with how they analyzed the dental calculus or dental plaque that missed something, but they looked at the dental plaque of this one individual and they didn't find any meat consumption. There was no meat in the dental calculus. They only found plant-based foods in the dental calculus, suggesting perhaps this individual had a very plant-heavy diet, and that was based on the environment they were in and the food that was available to them. And moreover, there's even more nuance to it, because 20 years ago, the isotopic analysis was a little bit more broad, less nuanced, and newer techniques are coming in where they look at individual amino acids and look at those isotopic analysis of those. And this was done with some fossils from Spy Cave in Belgium, some Neanderthal fossils there. And they found that possibly up to 20% of the diet of these individuals was actually plant-based. Originally, it was believed that it was just all animal-based, but now it doesn't mean it was 20% plant-based, but it could be up to 20% plant-based based on newer, more refined techniques. So even some of this old evidence, and this is in an area that is more like conifer and tundra, places where it would have been higher meat consumption because that was all that was available. So in actual fact, what you see is that both ancient humans and Neanderthals were eating what was available to them, and if they were in high tundra, yeah, they ate a lot of meat, but if they were in another place, they would eat a completely different diet. what I think you really see is that ancient humans were the omnivores that they are, that we always have been, which is, I would argue we are the preeminent omnivores that have ever existed on the earth. Now, you could argue that a bear is an omnivore and they would probably eat anything we would eat, but they don't and they can't, and they never have and never will. They don't have tools, they live in specific ecological niches, they cannot get outside of that. We have the brains and the tools to build boats and nets and eat deep sea fish and hunt every animal on the face of the earth and use guns to capture whatever we want. And we do, in fact, eat just about everything on the face of the earth: insects, plants, animals, fish, whatever it is. No other animal has ever existed that eats as many things as we do. We are the ultimate omnivore, I would argue. And you can see that in this fossilized diet of eating whatever is available in the area. That's what ancient humans would eat. So I want to touch on another aspect of the diet that they found in the fossil record, and that is that the diet is a diet we wouldn't eat today, in large part. So for example, they were eating things like moss. It's clearly a part of the diet of some Neanderthals. They were eating moss. And this to us is kind of incomprehensible. Why would somebody regularly eat moss? The answer is it was local. It was what was available to them. They lived at a local level that we cannot comprehend in our world of agriculture and global trade. We can't imagine a place where locally this was the only thing was available, and if that was the only thing available, we would just eat moss because that was what was available to us. We live in a world where we think, okay, I buy local. I get tomatoes from my local farmer who's just a few miles down the road. That's not really local. Those tomatoes were actually a local food at one time, several thousand years ago, in a particular area in north central South America. And for those people in ancient times before agriculture, they could access tomatoes, but everyone else couldn't. And they domesticated them. They started trading. People in what is today Mexico got these domesticated tomatoes and further domesticated them, and then the Europeans colonized the Americas and brought them to Europe and Africa and Asia. And today you will find locally adapted varieties of tomatoes on every continent of the earth. People literally everywhere on the earth will grow tomatoes in their backyards. They'll grow them local farms. There's local production of tomatoes on every continent on the face of the earth. And largely in almost every environment on the face of the earth, people grow tomatoes. Even in the desert, they grow tomatoes in greenhouses. Even on scientific stations, I'm sure they grow them for the scientists living at those scientific stations. And tomatoes are exemplary of our modern world. They are the result of global trade, some competition in different foods, and there's a reason why they spread everywhere. They're so palatable, relatively low fiber, unlike moss, for example, which is really high fiber. You could grind it a lot, maybe get a few vitamins and minerals out of it, but it wouldn't provide any calories. We don't have the digestive system of goat to eat moss. Tomatoes, on the other hand, have just the right amount of fiber. They're loaded with nutrients, vitamin A, vitamin C. They have a nice little punch of calories, not a huge amount of calories, but enough that you wouldn't starve. They're incredibly delicious, so they're palatable, you can digest them, they're loaded with nutrients, and they taste so good. And people everywhere trade them because there's a reason why they traded them. There's a reason why everybody on Earth eats them. They're really good. And I think if a person in the Paleolithic had access to a tomato, their life would be transformed. It would be incredible. They would immediately give up their moss eating and start eating tomatoes instead, and for good reason. And so, our world has everything we eat, all the fruits and vegetables we eat are the product of agriculture. And I would argue that there's a competitive process in this, that if you look at parsnips and potatoes in Europe, for example, before potatoes were introduced, parsnips were eaten as your sort of basic starchy root for a soup or a stew. And once potatoes were introduced, they were more productive, they were bigger, they tasted better, and people started growing potatoes. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't eat parsnips. They may have some vitamins and things that are good to eat, but there is a competitive process. And I also would like to say there are a lot of foods that have been lost to time that should not have been lost for reasons that have nothing to do with competition, just cultural reasons that overlooked some very good things, like foods of the ancient Inca, for example. But nevertheless, there is a competitive process that happens. And so some of the most palatable foods, the most delicious foods, the most nutritious foods are the ones that just come to the top and come to the fore. And so going back to the paleo diet, you can't say, oh, eating lean meats with lesser amounts of non-starchy fruits and vegetables is a paleo diet. It's not a paleo diet. Paleolithic people would never have had access to the fruits and vegetables we have access to. So it completely doesn't mirror at all a Paleolithic diet. If you want a Paleolithic diet, eat literally whatever's local, including the moss off of the trees, and you'd be much closer to a Paleolithic diet. And so I guess the takeaway here is that, if you access the bounty of our agricultural system, a global competitive system has developed over several thousand years, foods like the tomato or potatoes or broccoli or blueberries, which are actually domesticated recently, but still, they're all have a nutritional value and a palatability and a taste that is incomparable to anything in the past. And if you fully access that, especially with what I would call superfoods, in other words, the very best of the best, agricultural foods that are just so dense with nutrition that it is just over the top, which is what I would call a superfood. If you access those foods, you're going to be so much ahead of the Paleolithic. And so yes, I would say superfoods beats a paleo diet. And the paleo diet is not what people think it is. So with that, thank you. Good night.